There we have our one Spyder chassis back from glass bead blasting, and it's had a layer of primer applied to it as well. Today I am going to flip the chassis back over to the correct orientation. It's currently upside down, and then try and create a flat floor setup so I can measure some diagonals and verify that the chassis isn't twisted. But whilst it's here in the workshop, it's a good chance now that it's clean to have a look at it in its raw state and see what kind of condition it's in. Obviously it looks a lot better now that it's been blasted and painted, but going around it there's a few things that I have noticed on it which are interesting quirks, a little bit to do with the history of the car. So the first thing that I obviously notice, this body mounting plate has seen some damage, not only on the edge of the plate here, but if you look at it from a side angle, you can see that the plate is bent and the channel has been splayed that way. These threaded sections here, they're interesting. I didn't remove anything from them, so I wonder if they're used on the standard Lotus configuration gearboxes rather than the ZF that we've had fitted to the car. I still need to fix this handbrake adjuster, which has still got the thread trapped in it, but that's a task for another day. A bit of evidence of previous beating that chassis mounting plate, in fact both of them have taken. Now it's got a bit of damage on the side there. These plates here are the ones that the roll cage mounts onto, so this hole and that hole are your standard mounting points. The other two on each side are added for the centre tunnel mounting of the roll cage. So the guy that's doing the bodywork is going to probably cut those off and weld on slightly wider plates on it, so you don't have this situation where the hole's bursting through the edge of the plate. Going a little bit further back, I noticed that this profile has been chopped and ground at some point in the past. That wasn't my doing. And then the rear wishbone mounts, I don't know what the standard is with these, but if you notice on this back one, for example, you've got the hole in the plate with a washer doubling that up, and those are sort of line bored, so they're in the same orientation. If you look over on the other side of the chassis, so this would be the passenger side normally, I noticed that isn't done as neatly. That looks to me like it's definitely been a repair. And also on the back, you can see clearly at some point a wishbone has got loose and damaged the inside profile of both of those. And the same situation on the front one. That's a very thick washer that's been put on there, and the further forward one you can see as well. Now they are still in a straight line as you look through them, so they don't present a problem for getting the bolt through to mount the wishbone, just they're not a particularly neat situation. If you're a geek like me, you find this type of thing interesting. So I just flipped the chassis over, and flipping the chassis over, I did it by hand, and I found the centre of gravity, or the centre of balance of the chassis is right here. Now where this gets interesting, or I think it's interesting anyway, is this point here is the centre of balance of the chassis. Then I got the measuring tape out, and from the very front point of the chassis to the tail of the chassis is 100 inches. There you go, just at a slight angle, 100 inches. And that point right there is 50 inches. So the centre of the chassis is also the centre of mass of the chassis. That's your balance point right there, which is a really useful thing to have on a chassis for when you're trying to achieve a 50-50 weight distribution in a car. Because obviously you'll have the engine and gearbox in the front, which will sit in this section in front of the centre of mass of the chassis, and then here you'll have passenger, sometimes driver, most times, and the fuel tank sits right back here, and then you've got a fairly heavy diff in there as well. All of that helping to contribute to the overall balance of the car. Now, looking at the chassis from a top-down point of view, there's probably not as much interesting things to note as there was looking from the bottom up. The guys have stuck a bung on here to stop any glass beads going into the vacuum reservoir tube, which is this section here. So that's the tube that's used to store a kind of a vacuum accumulator for the headlights and for the brakes. Chassis plate on there from Spyder when it was built, and the Spyder tag rivets in there. I took that off, and a wee notch out the chassis to give a bit of gearbox clearance. And then you've got this piece of steel here with the thread in it. That's for the tail mount of the gearbox. These holes that you can see in this profile, this one up the top, that's to run the fuel line through, and this one down on the bottom, that runs the handbrake cable through. I think this one is redundant, as is this mount on this side, and those would be for the handbrake cable if you were on a left-hand drive car rather than a right-hand drive car. Obviously you still have these tags etc in place for your brake hose mountings, and then you've got the threaded section here, which is for the seat belt's inner attachment that screws into there. Your rear frame turrets here, the top mounts for the shocks, or the rubber cones, go into there. So now what we're going to do is try and get this chassis over, and I'm going to use a combination of axle stands, plywood and spirit levels to try and come up with a flat floor and do some diagonal measurements on the chassis to check for straightness. The basic plan for the flat floor setup: 2 axle stands set to the same height. I'm going to use little pieces of cardboard on them just to prevent them from scuffing up the newly applied primer. But put the axle stands on top of the plywood. That will stop the dimples on the floor causing any wobble or any imbalance, hopefully. And then we'll use the spirit level to check for flatness on the floor, then lift the chassis up onto it. And once the chassis is up on the 2 front axle stands, we'll do a similar situation for something at the back, and then we should be able to measure levels on the chassis, both between suspension hardpoints and between rails. And if we know that the ground is flat, we should be able to see any tilt or twist in the rails or in the suspension mounting points. That's my theory anyway. So initial setup, this is ridiculously hard to get a picture of due to the reflection of the light, but I think you can see that bubble is spot on in the middle. So ghetto flat floor is go. And what we've done is use 1 axle stand at the rear. That's partly due to space constraints. It's very difficult to actually get 2 axle stands in anywhere on the back when you don't have any suspension. But that is quite useful because with 2 points at the front and then a single point at the rear, it means that the chassis sits on the natural plane of the front vacuum tube. Unfortunately, the chassis plate is a little bit in the way of having the spirit level straight on the top of the tube, but if I get it on a flat plane on the tube, you can see the bubble is still in the center at the front. And if I go to the back and use these 2 hard points, which are for the diff mount, you find that on the back, again, the bubble sitting right in the middle. So that means your front plane there is flat and the back plane is flat. Now I'm still going to have to measure diagonals between the suspension mounting points on the front and on other points in the chassis to determine if there's any twist or variation there. But with it being flat at the front and at the back, if I run the spirit level along the backbone, if it changes and the bubble starts to vary either way, then I'll know that I've got some twist in the chassis through the middle of it. And I've already done that. So at the back, if you put it across the backbone, it's still bubble in the center there, which is what we're looking for. Unfortunately, as you come forward, one of the first ones that I immediately did, I think I can see a bend in that tube. Just eyeballing it, I think I can see a bend go down there, so the tube comes along, goes down, comes back up. And if I position the spirit level in line with the plates for the front engine mounts, straight away I noticed that the bubble's off to the side. So I think we're going to have to do a lot of careful measurements. The initial indications are that there might be an element of twist. That's not to say that the suspension points are out. They might still be okay. It might just be the plane that the body is mounted to that's out. So that could possibly be addressed via spacers, or if it's bad enough, then maybe the chassis needs to be jigged.